For those of you that don't know me, I'm from Centrim, Centre for Research for Innovation Management, which is part of the business school here. The title, T5 Success or Failure, is because I'm going to talk about both those things in relation to this project. I'd be interested, before I start though, to get a show of hands. You know, how many of you think T5 is a success? Put your hands up if you do. Right, and how many think it's a failure? Oh, that's great. That's very interesting, because I've given similar talks in the past, and which were a bit closer to the event of the opening, and there was a lot more failures in the audience then. So maybe part of it is the news that I think it was a couple of weeks ago, the new Berlin airport, the Willy Brandt airport, produced by the very efficient and effective Germans, didn't open. It's been delayed for months because of all kinds of problems and so on. So I'll just do that as a preface to this. The research that this is based on took place back in 2007, while the project was still, the construction project was still underway. And I should acknowledge some colleagues at Imperial College who were involved in the research as well. And while we were there, everything was going swimmingly. And, you know, it was a great story, but it was a little bit boring because it was a success. And then with the opening being a complete failure, for a researcher, this was wonderful. Suddenly there was something else to think about in this so-called success story. So I'm going to go through today and I'm going to talk about why I think the construction project was a success and why I think the opening was a disaster. And I'm going to leave you with some thoughts about those two things in relation to managing projects. So let's see where we get to. First of all, a few factoids about Heathrow Terminal 5. Capacity for an extra 30 million annually. So that took up Heathrow's capacity from 67 million up into the 97 million. So it was a huge expansion of capacity there. The background to that was that Heathrow is in competition with other hub airports around Europe, and anyone who'd been to Heathrow in the past knows what a god-awful place it was to try and take off from. So they needed to do something about it. At the time, it was Europe's largest construction project, £4.3 billion. So not an insubstantial project. And actually, we called it new infrastructure, we call it a system of systems, because there's many elements to this thing. Two main terminal buildings in the original project. There are actually two more satellites. One has been built and the fourth one may be built in the future. Lots of aircraft stands, a brand new baggage handling system, which goes underground, a hotel, large car park that goes with it. Road and rail extensions, so they had to build new roads to get to the new terminal and extend the underground and the Heathrow Express through the airport to reach the new terminal. The new terminal was going to be so high that the existing control tower couldn't see right away across. And that's one of the requirements of a control tower. It has to have visual communication with this. So they had to build a new air traffic control tower as well. The works involved diverting two rivers. I've got a little graphic later that shows you where the site was, and you'll be able to see that. And a lot of this stuff took place underground. We see the stuff on the top of the airport, but a huge amount of activity takes place underground. So there's major excavations, lots of tunnelling involved, particularly to do with the rail extensions and the baggage handling system. So what we see on the top when we're driving past isn't what's actually there. And that gives you a better idea of how much excavation they had to do. This is the main terminal building here, and this was the satellite here. And all these are the tunnelling and the underground stuff that's gone on. And all this stuff that was in there had to be taken off-site. The other thing about this that's quite interesting is it had to be in operation the whole time they were building this. So, key challenges of it. Largest, most complex project they'd ever undertaken. Now, BAA, former British Airports Authority, owned 7 airports at the time of this project. And they have billions of pounds worth of projects, ongoing capital projects, around those 7 airports all the time. But in addition to that, they have occasional mega projects like this one. So they built Stansted Airport, and this is pretty much equivalent to that. T5 site, very physically constrained and logistically challenging. Again, when I show you the picture, you'll see what I mean. On top of that, they had a planning inquiry, the longest planning inquiry in the history in the UK, which imposed over 700 conditions on the project. A lot of systems integration, lots of different technologies across the airport. I think there's some mention of more wiring around this terminal than there is in the whole square mile of London with all their trading boards and all the rest of it. And the other thing was that huge project risk associated with this. The capitalisation of BA at the time was around 6 billion, I think, and this project itself 4.3 billion. So any cost overruns could really affect the whole organisation, the whole future of the company. So a pretty important project as far as they were concerned. I'm going to go into a little more detail about the complexity stuff because I think it's quite interesting and can be applied to other projects. So why does complexity matter? Well, it matters because it affects how difficult it is to manage or execute a project or a programme. If you know what the complexities are, then you can take that into account and you adopt an approach that deals with those complexities. But too often in the project world, a lot of these complexities are ignored. People live in a bit of cloud cuckoo land where they think everything is going to run smoothly. But the reality of a lot of projects is that you're going to get difficulties during the life of the project. And if you adopt the wrong approach doing the project, there's a good chance that you might fail. So I'm banging this drum a bit because there is a view that every project is a project is a project. But I actually disagree with that entirely. I think that you have to tailor your approach to deal with the complexities that exist within a project. What is complexity in projects? I've been doing some work with colleagues at Cranfield University, and they carried out a literature review on this and found lots of categories, but they boiled them down to 3 main ones. Structural complexity, and that's the one I think most of us understand when we think about complexity. It's about how big it is, the number of parts, the number of components, levels of interconnectivity between different parts of a system or whatever. The second one, socio-political complexity, I think is probably one of the main reasons for project failure. This is because it involves people, power, politics, all these kind of things. But it's often not dealt with in project tools, and certainly not really in terms of risk, because it's difficult to quantify. And most risk registers, you have to put some kind of number on it. So you can deal with structural complexity with your risk management, but socio-political complexity is often ignored. And the final thing, and this is particularly true of large mega projects which take place over a number of years, is this idea of emergence, that strange things happen which you didn't predict at the start of your project. So how are you going to deal with those? There's lots of uncertainty in the project. It could be around technology, it could be around the environment in which you're doing your project. You have to have some kind of way of managing those kind of things. So, different complexities. How do you respond to them? If you've got high structural complexity, then you've got to pay close attention to planning and control to try and deal with the very size of this thing. And you can do that by using work breakdown structures and creating sub-projects and all these kind of things. If you've got socio-political complexity, it's a different kind of requirement. You've got to look at how you satisfy all those different stakeholders that might be involved in the project. How are you going to keep everybody happy at the same time? So you might need someone in your project management team who's quite political and who's pretty good at doing that kind of thing. And finally, with the emergence, you've got to have someone who's kind of scanning the horizon, looking for the things coming over the hill. Because it's not the things that you're expecting that kill projects, it's the ones that come from over here that you can't see. And they really get you. It's what they call the unknown unknowns, I think, in America. So that's the complexity bit. The physically constrained bit, I think, is also pretty important. As I mentioned, they had to keep the airport moving the whole time they're doing this. Now, this here, this is where the two rivers were, and it was a water treatment plant, a sewage works or something right here. That's where they decided they were going to put Terminal 5. And in their plans, that's what it looked like. We get rid of all that grass and water and stuff, and we put a load of concrete down. So this is the main terminal building, that's the other satellite. Those were the two that were originally planned. They built the third one that went in 2011, and they may build this if demand calls for it. This is Terminal 1 and 2 and 3, Terminal 4 over here. You see from this, there's one of the Heathrow runways, there's the other one. So it's right in the middle of the two runways. And this is one of the busiest airports in the world. So you've got to do all this stuff while you're having a plane land every minute or 30 seconds or whatever it is, takeoff or landing. Over here is the M25. You've got these main roads, the A4 up to London and so on and so forth. Reservoirs over here. So there's very little space around the whole site. And in the construction industry, usually what happens is you bring all your materials on site and you lay them down on site. Here there's very little lay down room. Even worse than that, in one of the conditions that the inquiry laid on them was that there'd only be one entrance to the site. So you've got to get all the materials to build this thing, all the people, and at peak there were 6,000 people working on this, in a security area, because of all the terrorist stuff that's going on. You've got to get those people in and out every day. And they also restricted working times as well. So there were a lot of constraints on this thing. So it's not an easy thing to actually do. There were these other constraints in the planning inquiry that I mentioned. Lots of different technologies. That creates more complications, more complexity within the project. One of the things they did to try and get around this was say, we're not going to introduce any brand new technology into this site. Nothing that hasn't been tested elsewhere is going to come on this site. So they tried to increase the predictability, if you like, of certain areas. And I said the final one about project risk, cost overruns could affect the future of BAA itself as a company. So they had to think about how to deal with project risk. So how did they deal with these things? One of the things they did, which I think was really interesting, was they said, we're going to try and learn from what other people have done. So they did a benchmarking study of all the major projects that they could, every construction project over £1 billion that had happened in the previous 10 years, and every international airport opening from the previous 15 years. And they built up this knowledge base of case studies about what had happened in these previous projects. They were all carried out in variations of traditional approaches, so they could be design and build, they could be construction management, could be PFI type projects, but they're all a kind of traditional approach. And they reckoned that their estimates were if they did this, it would cost 70% more than they budgeted for. It would be 3 years late, and in a worst case scenario, 12 people might die if they did this in the traditional way. And none of these were acceptable to them. And so they had no option, as far as they were concerned, but to try and find a different approach to managing this project. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes, is about this new approach. It happened in two steps, really. The first step was trying to create a standardized process for their routine projects. I mentioned that BAA had hundreds and hundreds of routine projects, capital projects. I mean, any of us that have been to airports know there's almost always some construction going on in some way or another in those things. This kind of approach coincided with John Egan becoming chairman of BAA. John Egan previously was chairman of the car company up in the Midlands, and he'd seen all the changes that had happened as a result of Japanese manufacturing processes coming in. And he was, quite frankly, he was appalled when he came to BAA that they didn't have standardization, that every time they did a project they started with a blank sheet of paper, that there were 60 different types of toilets in their airports. And he thought this was really a waste of a waste of opportunities with all these duplication of the kind of projects they did. He said, we're going to not stand for this anymore. We're going to find out what best practice is around the world and we'll create a process. And he put a team together that did that over a number of years. And the main things within that: concurrent design, so you're designing as you're manufacturing; standardized components, and these components could be at the level of individual components like toilets, but they could be at the level of a building. So as far as he was concerned, a car park, we'll build a car park at Edinburgh Airport and we'll use the same plans again and build one at Gatwick. And office buildings, things like that. So this kind of idea that you'd have standardized things. Framework agreements, something he bought from the car industry as well. Instead of having, every time you have a project, you have suppliers bid for the project, give them the opportunity to have a whole series of projects so that they get an opportunity to learn and create specialized teams. So he created framework agreements. The original ones were for 5 years. Instead of having to bid for every time they wanted a new piece of concrete put down in a runway area, you'd get that job and you'd know you get the one at Edinburgh and you get the one at Glasgow for the next 5 years. Later on, just before T5 was built, they introduced a second generation of these framework agreements, which had a bit more teeth in them and required you to have major improvement year on year. A kind of MOT was given to suppliers. But they were 10 years, so there was a balance in the risk-reward thing from these kind of things. And they used these to kind of find out which suppliers they could use and get surety of supply. So they knew they could guarantee the quality of the work these people were doing. Now, those were all kind of before T5, but they also introduced these other components, especially for T5. And the key ones are these two. Mentioned before about the high risk of this project. In their benchmarking study, they basically found it didn't matter which of the approaches were being used, the client was dumping the risk on the supply chain. But actually, the risk always returned to the owner, returned to the client, even though you had costs that you might be able to reclaim, damages you could get if you went to litigation. You still had to pay because it would be 2 years later, it would be much more than you wanted to pay and so on. And the second thing that was quite interesting was this idea of integrated project teams. If you know the construction industry, you know it's very fragmented, from the architects, structural engineers, etc., all the way down to main contractors and subcontractors and the trades and so on. And what often happens in construction projects is you get a blame culture where people say, it's not my fault, it's your fault, we're going to take you to law so that you can pay us liquidated damages for not completing your piece of work on time. And they wanted to get away from this idea. And some of the people who'd worked at BAA for a while had been involved in, I don't know if you remember, when they were building the Heathrow Express, there was a tunnel collapse there. And instead of going to the lawyers and litigating, they said, this has happened, luckily no one was killed in this tunnel collapse. We need to start a new project immediately to recover this thing. And they created integrated project teams to do this with no blame attached. And they literally dug themselves out of a hole and completed the project only 6 months behind the original schedule because they all forgot their differences and worked together. So that was quite important. And both these, client bears the risk and so on. This is the kind of traditional approach to risk, which is that the client there dumps the risk down on the contractor dumps it down onto their subcontractors and so on. So all the way down you're getting risk dumped down. What they said in T5, no, we're going to take all the risk because ultimately it comes back to us anyway. We're going to have integrated project teams involving the client and we'll call them partners, our framework agreement first tier suppliers that we work with. And then the partners will be responsible for pushing this down to their subcontractors in the same spirit of that, in the spirit of cooperation and so on. In return for this, BA said, we'll pay you what it costs to build this building, to build this construction, rather than having fixed price bids. Because what happens traditionally in construction is you go in with a low bid, lowest bidder wins, and then you get litigation and you try and get contract variations in order to be able to make a profit. And a good example that was going on at the same time of this was Wembley Stadium, which ended up being several years late, costing a lot more than it was originally planned, and firms were put out of business with this traditional method here. Created a blame culture. And the idea behind was that it would be success driven. We'd give you incentives to do better. We'll pay you what it costs, and we'll have externally benchmarked prices for these things to see if they're fair. But in return, if you're going to be a contractor on this, you have to have open books. We have to see exactly what your costs are and so on. But if you do better than that, then we'll have a profit share. So they guaranteed contractors, pay them what it was with a guaranteed percentage profit. So it's an interesting way of controlling costs, is to pay you what it costs. Anyway, all this was written down in a novel kind of contract. They called it the handbook and the T5 agreement. The handbook, it's a big fat thing, and it really details how you're going to work in this kind of an environment, right from the top, in great detail. And each of the contractors was given this and asked to read it. If they agreed to that code of conduct, to working in that way, they would sign it, and then it became the contract. And that's how they operated this thing. So basically what they were doing was kind of social engineering in a way, trying to change the behaviour of years and years of behaviour in the construction industry. Collaborative rules, integrated project team working, partnering. So anathema to a lot of people. Who did it apply to? Well, the T5 agreement worked across here. BAA was unusual because they were the client, but they owner and operator, but they were also working as the project manager for the whole project and as what we call a systems integrator. They were pulling everything together. And they were the first tier suppliers who were involved in this T5 agreement. The second tier suppliers and other contractors were the first tier suppliers who were part of the T5 agreement were supposed to use the same spirit of this agreement in the way that they managed their own subcontractors and so on. So that's where the T5 agreement came in. The other thing, here we have the single digital model. One of the problems of the fragmented supply chain in construction is that there's lots of opportunities for misinformation and for people not to be working to the same drawings, for not working to the same design when changes are made and so on. And so they said, we're going to just have one model that everybody uses. And the master model, if changes are made on that, everybody sees those changes. And so you don't get this opportunity for misinformation to go through. Fifth element of this, off-site pre-assembly and test. Because of this problem about one entrance and the restrictions on getting onto the site and so on, no lay-down space, they had to come up with an alternative arrangements. And what they did, they created off-site 2 consolidation areas, one at Colnbrook, where they had a railway line going in, bringing steel and concrete, and they did a lot of prefabrication of all the steel and concrete cages and prefabricated concrete panels, which were then brought onto site, already partly manufactured. The other part of that was testing. Because you didn't want to have unexpected things happen on the construction site, you test the method of construction off-site before you brought anything on there as well. So again, it's about learning. You know, you make your mistakes off-site, so when you come on-site, you can do things right. And the last element in this system was the just-in-time logistics. And again, this is really to deal with this problem of having no lay-down areas and having just one entrance to the thing. And what they did here was they took some software that had been used in the car industry and adapted it. I think I can't remember what they called it at the moment, but basically what happens every day after, you know, there's a plan of how much work you're going to do, and the materials are pulled on site for that amount of work that you're going to do. If things happen during the day and you don't finish, or there are problems elsewhere, then at the end of the day, you redo the schedule, and that goes back to these consolidation areas, and you rejig the work, partly because you've got these integrated teams who agree that they can rejig work together rather than work against each other. And then you just pull on site the materials that you can use the next day for that next day's work that you've got in. So all in all, quite a bunch of different things. None of these were new. That's what's quite interesting. They'd all been tried in different sectors, mostly in oil and gas and the offshore industry, where they had particularly harsh conditions for doing construction. But it was the first time they kind of put all these things together. So it's quite an interesting innovation in a way. How does this relate to the complexity thing I said earlier? Well, I think the structure complexity in this, this was a huge project by any means, lots of elements. So they broke the project down into 4 main areas and then into 147 sub-projects. Each of these sub-projects had an integrated project team in it, and they were co-responsible for the output of that, and they were co-responsible for solving any problems within that sub-project. And where they had interdependencies between projects, they had arrangements there as well. So it was a very complicated kind of set of arrangements between those different sub-projects in terms of the incentive schemes and things like that were going on. The single model environment helped with this structural complexity as well, because you'd only have one version of things, and the prefabrication as well. You could do a lot of this work off-site. You didn't have to have the complications of lots of stuff going on site. The socio-political complexity, the T5 agreement and the integrated teams were really the innovations that dealt with that. As I said, it was a code of behaviour really about how you were going to work together, and you would always return to that T5 agreement if there were any debates or any problems that arose. The emergent complexity, well, partly the reimbursable contracts dealt with that, so if you've got unexpected things happening, they'd still pay you what it costs to sort those out. You had incentives to innovate, so if you did things faster or quicker or better than the benchmarking, then you could make more profit. The just-in-time logistics also helped this emergent stuff, so if there was any problem that arose, you could deal with it by not putting loads of stuff on site and stopping other work being done. Finally, the uncertainty was dealt with by early experimentation, standardization of major components. So after they created this kind of standardized approach to doing projects, what they also did was test out a lot of these things. And this was where the public inquiry was actually a bit of a good thing for them, because it gave them lots of time to do these experiments and so on. So they proved in these experiments that you could put a car park in there, put a car park in there, put a car park in there, using the same design. The idea was design once, build many times, and you'd get improvements in terms of productivity and in terms of cost over those times. They did lots of this pre-assembly, they tried these things before, and off-site testing. And as I mentioned before, they had this policy of not adopting untested technologies. And that was one of the problems with the reporting of it. They said, oh, this is another one of those IT disasters because they've just introduced this big bang new IT system. But actually it wasn't true. They had been tested elsewhere before they were put in here. So at that time, as researchers, this was this was a piece that came out in one of the magazines, Terminal 5 History in the Making, because it was on budget. It was on time, and that was very unusual for a mega project. Hadn't really been done before. And so that was the whole kind of ethos that was there, the atmosphere when we went into the projects. One thing I do remember though was when we were in all the project teams, in the corner they'd have a clock that was counting down to the opening day. In fact, it said the 30th of March, I think, 2008 was when they were going to open. The actual opening day was 27th of March, and I think they just did that so they could say that they were ahead of schedule, you know, when they completed. But this was a tool they had which was driving everything they did, this clock. It was the one kind of thing they wouldn't relax on, was this deadline. And I think that kind of came back to haunt them in the end, a little bit. So, I've got a few quotes here. This was Tony Douglas, who was director of the T5 project, but then later on, by 2007, they made him chief executive of the whole of Heathrow, as they were hoping that Heathrow would pull the project off the project team. He was in charge, and you may have seen him when there were all those problems about security and stuff. He was the guy who used to have to go to the microphone and do it. So he was celebrating a year before, saying this was a fantastic achievement on the construction side, testament to the skills and hard work of all these people. With just a year to go, 360. Still much to do, but we're confident we're on track to deliver a world-class experience that Heathrow's passengers deserve. I find it hard not to kind of giggle at these quotes after the event. But and then there was Willie Walsh. Now he was chief executive of British Airways, and British Airways was going to be the main occupant of Terminal 5. A historic breakthrough, transform the airport experience for our customers. Less queuing, faster baggage systems, better punctuality, comfort and convenience that exceeds the best you can find anywhere. Yeah. Again, it's going to be very busy over the next 12 months, but we're on track and we'll be ready for the 27th of March when the first flights begin. So lots of confidence a year before. 2 weeks before the opening of the airport, when the first flights were, there was an official opening where Her Majesty the Queen went. It gives me great pleasure to open Terminal 5, this 21st century gateway to Britain, and for us to the wider world. So she was impressed too, you know, it's pretty good. Good old Mr. Walsh again. It's a fantastic facility. Our customers will really enjoy the space, comfort and convenience it offers. With the opening of T5, BA and BAA have the opportunity to make air travel both into and out of the UK once again a calmer and much more enjoyable experience. So that was what we were expecting. What did we get? Shambles. Desk closed. Welcome to Terminal 5, desk closed. Cancelled, 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 cancelled. All that luggage there. Another one, welcome to our new home. There's lots of us can live here. So that was the reality of the first day. And remember the making history thing? This was one of the headlines in the Times. Making history, memorable, but for all the wrong reasons. So all this promise, all this success dissipated within a number of hours. So what happened? Well, this is where it gets quite interesting. It's not anything major, it's lots of little things. So the first thing, passengers and staff had trouble locating the car parks. Now you think, how can that happen? Well, they did lots of tests. In the year leading up to this, they did lots of tests with thousands of people, up to 6,000 people at a time. But they're all bussed on there. The people that are working there are in their normal car parks, and then they're bussed over to do the tests and so on. And these are all new car parks, new allocations, new signs. They've never done it before because they didn't test that. So people having trouble locating car parks. So they're late getting to their stations, they're late getting to the check-ins and things. This is compounded. They have problems getting through security. So all these people getting delayed actually getting in to do their work, delayed the opening of the check-in. So you get long queues happening. The first passengers that arrive, because there was a plane flying, coming over from Hong Kong I think, they arrive, but they have to wait now for luggage, because there's problems with the allocation of luggage handlers. They've got some new little gizmos and they've left some wrong data in there, so nobody knows which bits of luggage are going where. Same kind of problem as the check-in people had. Baggage handling people have problems logging onto their systems. They log on 3 times and they're kicked out, which means they're locked out of the system. This was their resource management systems. They were incorrectly allocating baggage handlers to load-unload flights, so they were being sent to the wrong places. Check-in staff, all this was going on. The check-in staff continued to add luggage into the system. So you can imagine what's happening. Luggage is coming on one end, the other end, there are no baggage handlers taking it off. Wonderful. So you get a clogged conveyor. So you've got, and this is on the entrance as well, rather than just, on the exit. So people waiting for luggage who are arriving, these kind of things. So both sides, clogged conveyors, 20 flights had to be cancelled by lunchtime. And then eventually there's a whole kind of systems failure, so they suspend all check-ins. This is by about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Long queues form at the fast bag drop, and they suspend check-in of all luggage into the hold. So, end of the day, 34 flights been cancelled, hundreds of passengers, as we saw from those pictures, are stranded. Similar problems happened on Friday as well. Severe delays, more cancellations, and by Saturday, a backlog of 15,000 bags were hanging around in Heathrow, which were then sent, of course, to Milan, because that's where you send baggage to get relocated, and it took weeks for some of this stuff to go on. So that's what happened, lots of little things. And this brings us back to the complexity. Now, construction's quite complex, and there's loads of things, but it's not quite as complex as running an airport. And it's what, in the literature, we call a complex, tightly coupled system. Right? A complex system exhibits complex interactions when it has unfamiliar, unplanned or unexpected sequences which are not visible or not immediately comprehensible. Design features such as branching and feedback loops, opportunities for failure to jump across subsystem boundaries. And an airport operation is just like that. Tightly coupled when it has time-dependent processes which cannot wait. Rigidly ordered processes, so sequence A must follow sequence B or whatever. Same in an airport. You've got to check in, put your baggage, then you go to the next thing, and so on and so forth. There's only one path to a successful outcome in that thing. And we've all been subject to where it goes wrong. I'm sure we've lost bags on the way. And there's very little slack in one of these tightly coupled systems. So when things go wrong, they compound together and create this kind of disaster. And this guy, Charles Perrow, wrote this book called Normal Accidents. He studied the 3 Mile Island nuclear meltdown in the USA, and then wrote this book about this. Failure in one part, whether it's material, human or organisation, may coincide with the failure of an entirely different part. We can see from that list that there are all these kind of different things going on at the same time. And actually, it's the unforeseeable combination that creates this cascading failures of other parts. So you get these knock-on effects that ripple their way through the system. And in these complex systems, these combinations are practically limitless. So it's very difficult to predict these. And you get this unraveling of the whole system. They have an intelligence of their own. They expose hidden connections, neutralize redundancies, so you can try and deal with them by putting redundant systems in and all these kind of things. Bypass them, firewalls, all these kind of things. So you can't design for every eventuality in a tightly coupled complex system. And so the failures happen and they accelerate out of control sometimes. Confounding human operators, denying them a chance for recovery. And they're normal in tightly coupled complex systems. So this was a disaster waiting to happen, is one interpretation of this. And what Perrow says is hindsight is often the only way to spot the causes of a normal accident. You can't predict it, but once it's done, you can go back over what's happened and you can see what's happened. So what did they say? Good old Willie Walsh again. The benefit of hindsight, it's clear we'd made some mistakes. In particular, we compromised on the testing regime as a result of delays in completing the building program for T5. In other words, it's BAA's fault. And the fact that we compromised on the testing of the building did impact the operation at T5 on the first few days after its opening. Now this gets back to this clock ticking in the corner. They weren't prepared. They knew about these delays in certain things. They weren't major, but there were some areas of the airport that hadn't been completed. But they wouldn't compromise on the opening date. They said, no, we're going to go ahead with this anyway. And what did Colin Matthews, Chief Executive of BAA, said? This one I think is really interesting. The benefit of hindsight, we might have adopted a more humble position. I like that word, because actually they were incredibly arrogant before. They thought they'd done it. Their diagnosis of the whole problem at the start was about the construction. They thought that was the difficult bit. But that's the easy bit compared to managing all those people in a tightly coupled system. And they just forgot about that. All the principles they had in the T5 agreement weren't followed through. It was unfortunate we created an expectation of perfection. Yes, you did, because you didn't actually understand the system that you were going to be implementing in operation. It was different from this other thing. Go back to this. T5 agreement was down here with BAA's role as project manager and systems integrator, and with the suppliers who did the construction. It didn't operate across this divide. And that was one of the problems, I think, was that it didn't actually have the same kind of integrated team working between the people who were going to be occupying the building and the owner of those facilities. And so they didn't really manage that interface. So when they moved into operations, they didn't have the same kind of safeguards in place and the same kind of cooperation that might have prevented this thing. So, a few final comments on this. Okay, this is a big mega project, so you think it might not have lessons for other more mundane projects or more straightforward projects. I disagree. Projects, programs differ in complexity. And that complexity manifests itself in very different forms, structural, socio-political, emergent. And what's complex for someone who's doing it for the first time may be very straightforward for someone who's done that kind of project lots of times. So it depends on who's doing the project as well, as to what the effects of this complexity can be. How difficult does it make it to manage this complexity? So that's the real issue of this, is how complex it is. How does that make it hard to manage a project or not? If you've got a one-size-fits-all approach to projects, irrespective of this complexity thing, then you're pretty guaranteed to get into some kind of problems, I think. You have to be able to adapt to take into account this variation in the complexity and the context in which the project is taking place. And that approach should vary according to all those dimensions, not just about the structural one. Most, as I said, most risk registers and most risk management activities relate to this structural thing. They fail to deal with these other things because you can't quantify them. And risk management is based on a kind of probability theory approach. So you have to put numbers to it. And you can do that with structural complexity. So that's about the complexity thing. And I think the other thing that's quite interesting is that projects usually are considered to start on the first day of the project when the contract's been signed. But actually, there's a lot of preparatory work that has to be done before these things. And one of the reasons the construction phase worked here was because of all that experimentation and preparation they'd done prior to the actual construction project getting underway. And the last thing, yeah, you can't really judge whether a project's been a success or failure until it's been in operation and into the operational phase for a while. When we were doing the initial interviews, they said then, the people from BAA said, we won't really know whether this has been a success or not until it's been operating a year. It's got to go through a hot summer and a cold winter for us to know whether this terminal works or not. And it's quite interesting. I think if you look at the figures now for throughput through the terminal, it's quite good. You know, most people I know, apart from the problems now with passport control and immigration and those kind of things, say that there's a bit of a flow. And that was the original design intent of this new terminal. It's the largest single-span building in the country to allow you to reconfigure everything within it. And because BAA make 40% of their profits from shopping and restaurants, that's where they want you. They don't want you held up in check-in and having to go to baggage people. They want you in their shops making money for them, and that's really the design process for this. So, was it a failure? Was it a success? I think it's a success from the construction point of view, because they did something that most mega projects don't do. Also, I think it's actually quite successful in terms of airports. As I mentioned at the start of this thing, the latest kind of disaster in that is the airport of Berlin. And if anyone was going to do it right, you think it would be the Germans. But they've made the same mistakes, despite the fact that they had T5 to learn from. And the main difference with that is, instead of going ahead with the opening, they said we can't open yet because otherwise it's going to create a disaster. But the furore in the press was exactly the same as we saw here. So there's something here about difference between the rhetoric and the reality. There was too much rhetoric from BAA and BA before this. The reality we saw a bit later, but there was too much rhetoric in the press as well about the failure aspect of it, and not enough recognition of the reality of the success story that I think it is. So I'll finish there, but I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you might have.